Nathan White. I'm with Access Now, the digital rights group. Let's wake up. First, let's give another round of applause for Mr. Cerf. That was a great presentation and started today. Thank you, sir. So I was supposed to come on stage and tell you about the structure of the panel that we're about to go into, and I had the great fortune to introduce Professor Benkler of Harvard University. Unfortunately, he missed a plane this morning and is not able to be with us. So we're going to do a little bit of a soft shoe, but I think it's going to work out, especially with that presentation from Mr. Cerf. I think we're on a good standing. We have a good framework to talk about the issues. One thing I did want to mention is that Professor Benkler was going to talk to us about how information spreads on the internet. He has these wonderful heat maps that I wish I could show you. He recently conducted some research, and I have the unenviable position of trying to describe someone else's work, so forgive me for the mistakes that I'm about to make. But I think what he was trying to present is that the issue, at least in the last election in the few recent years, is not so much fake news, which is the sites that you mentioned that sell ad space based on things that have no basis in reality, but rather disinformation, which is based in reality, but is used in a biased way to present a counter-narrative for people. And that makes sense to me because I come from the world of politics. And if you've ever worked on a campaign, you know that a campaign is all about building a narrative. Your candidate has a life story, they have a vision, they have a view of the world, and you want to present that to the public and the voters. I have my narrative, my opponent has their narrative, and the voters then get to choose on which narrative is accepted and gets to go lead the government. Fortunately or unfortunately, the internet allows us each to have our own narrative. And with algorithms that focus on engagement and stickiness and showing us what we want to see, we can live entirely within our own narratives and never be challenged by anyone else's narrative. And so this is the environment that we live in. That's the environment that gives us compromat, it enters trolls, it enters botnet, we have media consolidation, we have ad revenue, we have failing business models, and we don't really know how to go from here. It creates challenges for us, and as an internet governance organization, we have to figure out how we're going to make sure that the internet is a good thing for all people for the future. And so that's really the conversation that we're going to be having here today. And now getting to the reason why I'm on stage to talk about structure is that we're going to have a very brief presentation from Mr. Craig Newmark, founder of Craigslist. Then we will have another short presentation from Ambassador Karen Kornblue, who is Senior Fellow for Digital Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. And then we'll move into a panel discussion, which will include those two as long as my colleague, Ms. Amy Stepanovich of Access Now, led by the legendary Dana Priest of the Washington Post. We will have some time for audience questions as well. In order to save time, we're trying to get away from reading bios from the stage, so you have handouts. If you want to learn more about any of the people who are on stage, you can find them in your handouts. I am not in there because I'm not supposed to be on stage. And with that, I will get off the stage and turn it over to Mr. Newmark.
Folks, around 1970, that's when I took high school U.S. history, and Mr. Shulsky got me to learn, well, the way I put it these days, is that a trustworthy press is the immune system of democracy. A well-running press saves us from electoral disasters, that kind of thing. And so we made sure that we really understood what that was about, and for that matter also the Declaration and the Constitution. I've actually remembered that in the decades since, and nowadays I feel, I'm not in the news business. I'm an outsider. As a nerd in the old school sense, I'm always going to be an outsider. But right now in this context, please regard me as nothing more than a news consumer, and as a news consumer, I just want news that I can trust. This is a really big, difficult problem that a lot of people in the news industry and in the social platform industry, they're just beginning to address. It's just the very beginning. There will be missteps. You're starting to see them as Organizations like Facebook and Google News have tried to address them. Now Twitter, I imagine we'll see Apple News trying to work on this. As an outsider who's interested and who's maybe learned a little, what I'm starting to do is work with organizations operating in good faith who are trying to do real things, pragmatic things, down-to-earth things, so that we can get to a point where we have trustworthy journalism again, acting as the immune system of democracy. I'm going to skim the surface of that. We don't have a lot of time to really go into it, and frankly, if you give me a lot of time to do it, I'll probably do it, so you want to remove that temptation from me. So I'm going to give a lot of these efforts short shrift. They deserve a lot more detail. An important theme of what's emerging among these organizations of good faith is that everything is driven by choice. News organizations choose, if they wish, to devote themselves to codes of ethics, to seriously adhere to codes of ethics. Newspaper organizations will adhere as part of that to, well, when they make a mistake, they'll do something about it. They'll fix it. On the platforms, the social networking platforms, the hope is that they will choose to adhere to a system which provides choice to the users or consumers of those systems, because no one wants to act as an arbiter of truth. The idea is that the platforms will give people the options to choose whether or not they'll be seeing stuff from news organizations who have chosen to act in an ethical manner and follow through with that, or they can choose to see pretty much everything, and then it's just buyer beware pretty much. Again, no one in the emerging framework is an arbiter of truth, and that's a big deal. Looking ahead a little bit, it's important to remember that, because bad actors, in an attempt to criticize people acting in good faith, they're going to accuse them of being arbiters of truth, and this is already happening. The beginning here is that there's something called the Trust Project out of the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics out of Santa Clara University. They're working with a lot of news consumers and a lot of news organizations to figure out what do they mean by trustworthy behavior, in a news organization. Now, I'm pretty simple-minded. For me, it comes down to like a diversity policy, meaning you're going to listen to people of all sorts, along the whole political spectrum. It means to be trustworthy, you have to have some kind of code of ethics, including dicta like don't make stuff up. And also, in practice, even if you're operating in good faith and trying really hard, doing good research, doing good fact-checking, if you do make a mistake, because this is going to happen, then correct it quickly and seriously, and that makes a difference. So that's the deal with the Trust Project. It's already getting adherence within the news organization community. That's a start. The problem is that what happens when you get news organizations who commit to trustworthy behavior, who commit to a code of ethics, who commit to being fair and balanced, and then immediately they renege on those commitments? What do you do about that? That's really hard. It's also dangerous work. Fact checkers already are subject to being attacked, both in terms of reputation, harassment, and so on. More on that in a few moments. But the deal is that we need networks of fact checkers operating in a mode kind of trust but verify. The deal is that most news organizations are going to operate in good faith, in a trustworthy manner. What these networks of networks need to do is to say, hey, that's for real. These organizations are really doing it. But there's going to be exceptions to that. And right now, these networks of networks are talking about not only individual fact checks, which take time, but they're speculating about things like credibility scores so that when you're looking at a news organization, you can have some idea of what's going on there. Let's say if Google News is deciding on how it's going to order search results, they might tend to look at something like, well, how credible is one organization compared to another? But it won't be Google making any decisions there. They won't be acting as an arbiter of truth in any manner. The idea is they'll be looking at a credibility score done by networks of fact checkers. This is already in process. The Poynter Institute, which is a big deal when it comes to journalistic ethics, they already have assembled this international fact-checking network. In the US, the most prominent fact checkers, that's PolitiFact and Snopes, Snopes.com. Not a perfect system, more are emerging. First Draft Coalition is building its own network of networks to do fact-checking. Both groups are building networks of fact-checking across the entirety of the world. The idea is that if you have a lot of people acting in good faith to do this kind of thing, you can get some good results. The theory, something initially suggested in some form by Jeff Jarvis for Google News, ultimately is that you can do things like, well, when you see an article in a set of listings from different news organizations, it could be that the news credibility score will show up as a badge that could be color-coded. News organizations with a really good history of acting in good faith, maybe they show up with a green badge. News organizations which kind of try, but often get it wrong and never correct their mistakes, maybe they get a yellow badge. News organizations which make stuff up frequently, never correct things, maybe they get a red badge. This is what the people in the news business are thinking right now. I'm just reporting on what I think I hear, but as a news consumer who doesn't want to see anyone acting as an arbiter of truth, this is kind of what I want to see, because I want enough information to decide, should I share that article? Because I really don't want to share something which there's a high probability that it's a lie. That would be like awkward. So I want to be careful about that thing. And since I'm not a very patient guy, I'm okay seeing news that I disagree with if the news has been fact-checked and the news organization acts in good faith, and when they make mistakes, they correct them. So I'm okay with that, but I might want the platforms to give me the chance, maybe in the form of a checkbox or two. I might want to say, hey, I only want to see the stuff from organizations which act in good faith, which are trying to get it right. Again, the idea is that some news organizations consistently try to get things right, they check facts, and they correct their mistakes. So I'm pretty much okay, just seeing stuff from news organizations which are trying to act in good faith, because fact-checking is expensive and time-consuming. But the fact-checking networks, they can compile scorecards for organizations. And this is really good for those news organizations which are trying and acting in good faith. And it may not be so good for those news organizations which just feel it's okay to make stuff up. That kind of works for me, and more importantly, I suspect, it works for the advertising industry, particularly the advertising networks and the ad tech people, because they're finding that their advertisers don't want to be on sites, they do not want to be on sites which operate in bad faith. They don't want to be on sites which make stuff up. They don't want to be on sites which have news slanted in a racist direction. They really don't want to be associated with that. And so the major advertising networks are creating the open brand safety standard, which will emerge out of the work that I'm talking about. And the idea is that the advertising networks will tell their advertisers, hey, you can pay for advertising on sites operating in good faith or bad faith or whatever's in between, but there's a conscious choice needs to be made. Which is to say, there's hope for this kind of thing, because for some folks like me, I just want to see people operating in good faith, but the advertisers want to put their money where their mouth is in terms of supporting trustworthy news. In the land of Wikipedia, this comes down to what's a reliable source or not a reliable source. Because from my point of view, Wikipedia is journalism. Wikipedia is where facts go to live. Wikipedia has a lot of problems. Bios of living persons have mistakes, and it's hard to correct them. But Wikipedia is where facts go to live, and they have issues with reliable sources, which, well, we're beginning to solve, because I'm on their advisory board, and this is a big deal. The same problem that I was just talking about for news consumers. Wikipedia's standards for verification rest completely on the notion of reliable sources, and that's going to be a big deal as we move forward. One last problem that I'm actually trying to help news organizations work together on. Right now in the US and beyond, if you're a reporter and if you're reporting on things people don't like, well, in the US, you may be subject to a lot of harassment, threats, sometimes death threats. They can get really ugly. Sometimes people will post your personal information online, like where you live and information about your family. There's been very little violence reported against reporters in the US, but it is a thing now. Outside the US, if you're a reporter, you're subject to a lot more danger. You may not enjoy getting a polonium cocktail. The situation out in much of the world is that reporters' lives are at risk really frequently. So what I'm doing is reminding news organizations, newspapers, that they need to protect their people, and that means getting their own in-house security teams to protect their people against harassment. They need to start doing things like the appropriate forensics, which is actually somewhat easier than it sounds until it gets very difficult. But I'm saying that newspapers need to work with each other to protect their people against harassment or worse, because it's only going to get worse before it's get better. So my focus is on helping the people who know what they're doing and who want to act in good faith for the news industry. The Trust Project helps figure out, what's trustworthy behavior, including codes of ethics and correction policies. We're beginning to see already networks of networks who are emerging to work together to figure out who's operating in good faith and maybe not. And then the news platforms, Google, Facebook, and others, are already working together, making attempts, sometimes successful, sometimes not, to give users the choice in terms of what they're seeing. Again, no one's acting as an arbiter of truth. The watchdogs are these networks of fact checkers. I'm hoping that the networks of networks are fact checkers create a entity which is too big to fail and too big to be attacked successfully, because these people, as well as existing journalists, are under threat right now. The bottom line is the silver lining, one of the silver linings in the election last November. A lot of journalists saw it as a wake-up call to return to kind of basics, to return to report courageously, to check facts, to operate in good faith, and then to work together. People like me, the wake-up call is to help the people doing good work in journalism, and then from there to put our money where our mouth is. Thanks, folks.
Ambassador Karen? Kornbluth?
Hi. So I've attempted to mush, that's a technical word, my presentation with Yochai Benkler's since he's not here, and I have been so enamored of his article that I happen to have a couple of slides pulled from his article, so you'll get a taste, a bad taste, because I'm not going to explain them correctly, and I really urge you all to read his article directly. So let me just start by saying I am not a geek, by which I mean a techie like many people in the audience. I'm a wonk policy person. And I just want to be nostalgic for a second. There are a bunch of people in the room who share these memories with me of the early days of the internet when the wonks, the policy people, really did have some design principles and really did have some agency and thought about what we wanted on the internet, what people wanted on the internet to help deploy this wonderful technology that Vint Cerf and others had developed. And so there were decisions that were made. So when AOL came along, it wasn't charged the same price as AT&T was for connecting to the local network, or email would have been prohibitively expensive. Spectrum, instead of giving out Spectrum to the prettiest face, we decided to auction it. Internationally, we led so that ICANN was developed as an international entity. We did 2 sets of WTO agreements to get regulations around the world that would allow interconnection and also to allow trade and services. Section 230 that limited liability for ISPs, on and on. The E-rate, we decided that schools and libraries needed to have access to the internet and that we would subsidize it even more greatly in more rural areas and in poorer areas. If you had a higher proportion of school lunch kids, you would get a greater subsidy. So we didn't sit back and just let technology develop. We decided that we wanted this thing to be open and free and available and really a force for democracy. I mean, I think the hope was that we would move from this world of one to many to many to many, and more power to the powerless, and greater opportunity for innovators to get on. And of course, this isn't the only area that we've all expressed agency and policy. Before this, the broadcast, there's a whole complicated legal structure. The broadcasters are considered fiduciaries for the public, which has all kinds of implications for their obligations in terms of political advertising, what they have to do in terms of news, in terms of local content. I sit on the board of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which was created to foster a free press overseas. So these are not things that we've been absent on. And I'm very disheartened right now because what I see as this internet that held out this great promise for democracy is in danger in some ways of becoming a place where instead of the powerless getting more power, the little guy having an opportunity, oops, did I do something bad? Maybe we're creating an opportunity for the powerful to gain more power, and that would be terrible. And I feel like we're being conditioned to give up, to think, in economics there's a big debate going on right now that there's been this elevation of markets that's made people ignore moral goals or social goals because the numbers make it all look neutral. And I think we're in danger of doing that a little bit in this sphere too. We think the technology makes it all neutral, and so we don't have to bring any design principles. So we say these bubbles are an inevitable feature of social media, and there's nothing we can do about it, that the news media and politics are just the latest casualty of disintermediation, and there's nothing we can do about it. And the big dark money is the price that we pay for the First Amendment. So this is all just a big lead-in for why I like Yochai Benkler's article, because it digs much deeper, and he's looked at he's done this social media study and looked at all these likes and shares and so on, and shows how unorganic some of what we saw was. So I'm just going to show you a couple of slides if I can figure out. I may need some help here. I definitely need some help here. I said I was a wonk. Okay.
Is that you?
Yeah. All right. This is all just a teaser. You got to just go get his article. It's in the Columbia Journalism Review. Okay. here are some of these hyper-partisan sites. And as he says, they combine decontextualized truths, repeated falsehoods, and leaps of logic to create a fundamentally misleading view of the world. These are the top immigration-related stories from the right-wing media shared on Twitter or Facebook. There you have the London mayor. London's Islamist-linked mayor tells U.S. audience immigrants shouldn't assimilate. Here you have up here, Mexico helping unvetted African migrants to U.S. border, many from al-Shabaab terror hotbed. 6 diseases return to U.S. as migration advocates celebrate World Refugee Day. Social Security Administration confirms illegal aliens to begin collecting benefits in 2017. It's not so innocent. I have the hardest time explaining this. Here's his heat map that was discussed earlier, or one of them. This is media sources shared on Twitter during the election, and the nodes are sized in proportion to the Twitter shares. And here are the highest at-real Donald Trump retweeters and the Hillary Clinton retweeters. And the main thing, I find this kind of hard to read. Maybe all of you who geeks understood that. This one is a little easier for me to understand. I think it tries to get at the same thing. The idea here is that the isolation, the bubbles that we think of, is asymmetric. So if this was just naturally a tech phenomenon, you would see the bubble on the right and the left. What you see instead is that on the left interacts with the mainstream. The left and the mainstream have many shared sites. On the right, it's just Breitbart is the many shared site, and they're really isolated from the center. The only sort of centrist things that you see shared with people on the right are the Wall Street Journal and The Hill. They really don't see the stuff on the left or in the center. Whereas people on the left, they're reading HuffPost, they're also reading the New York Times. So this seems to, and one of the things that really struck me in what he saw was during the primary, the right-wing sites led by Breitbart attacked Fox, because remember, Fox wasn't pro-Trump. After the primary, they shifted back to just attacking the mainstream media. So apparently part of this whole attack of the mainstream media is about creating this bubble. Again, I hope this is just a teaser, and you'll go back and take a look at the article. So here's some of this stuff about some of these highly shared Breitbart stories during the primary against Fox. Anti-Trump network, Fox News money flows into Open Borders Group. New York Times bombshell scoop, Fox News colluded with Rubio to give amnesty to illegal aliens. This is all on Breitbart. So what they go on to show is that the right-wing media claims they gain credence by combining a germ of a verifiable fact, which can often happen through a hack, paranoid conspiracy theories, and repetition, that the repetition through Breitbart and InfoWars and so on. So these are some of the more shared headlines. Lots of alliteration. And what the result that he shows is that the issues that were covered, this is most sentences most mentioned, and what you see is that Clinton's scandals get mentioned most, so her emails, and Trump issues, so immigration, gets mentioned most. So you say, how did that happen, right? But when you look at this very unorganic process, this is what you see. Number of sentences in mainstream media that address Trump and Clinton issues and scandals. It's really fascinating. So anyway, this is upsetting. I'm gonna try to provoke a little bit with some design ideas. I've been thinking about this a lot and wrestling with it. What do you do? Obviously, this is a new world. This is not the broadcasting world. We don't have the scarcity argument for having requirements. We don't want to turn ISPs into censors. So this is a really careful new area, and we really, really, really have to think about it, and it's a lot bigger than the internet, as I think all of this shows. So I'm going to lay out some semi-provocative ideas. Maybe you'll find them too tepid. One is disclosure. I mean, who can complain about disclosure? Scalia said that, disclosure was important in the political sphere, but we really don't have it. In broadcast cable, satellite, radio, they all have to disclose political ads. Those requirements are not there on social media. We have these bots and trolls, dark posts, so one person is given one lie and you're not accountable for it. It's not like a television ad where everybody knows that a candidate has put out a negative advertisement. So there's a lot of secrecy, there's a lack of disclosure. So what can we do to increase that? Should we even think about bots, trolls, dark posts be restricted in the political sphere? Are there requirements that need to be made for more disclosure in terms of who's buying ads? But then you get into this whole issue of, what's an ad and what's sponsored content? What would you call, Breitbart, what would you call it? Algorithmic integrity is the term I came up with. I'm not sure what the right one is. But right now there's a preference in social media for shareable, clickable, scalable. And as the Benkler stuff shows, that undermines civically important journalism in favor of extremist sensationalist journalism. So the algorithm's not really neutral. It really favors this kind of bad fake news. So is there something we can do to counter that? What can we do if the algorithm isn't truly neutral in the way we want it to be? How do we have more accountability for the money in politics? These C4 organizations are called social welfare organizations, and yet they're allowed to spend 50% of their money on political ads and never disclose who gives money. That's one easy place to start. What are the privacy issues with all this data collection and use in the political sphere? Obviously, we need to do stuff on voting. Again, I said this is not just about the internet. We need to do more on the anti-corruption and ethics efforts. The head of the Office of Ethics just quit saying that we needed to do more of this. So anyway, I just want to provoke and say that this is a big issue that we need to take responsibility for and have some agency on, and it's just too important for the internet itself and obviously for democracy. Thanks.
Okay, since we've totally blown through the plan. No, that's okay. It was all, you had different emphasis, so I think that's very helpful because really you've set out so much of what we wanted to talk about. First of all, I wanted to say this is so interesting to me that, I thought you were going to talk about the internet more, but you actually veered into talking about journalism, which is, of course, one of my favorite subjects. And I'm going to ask Amy, since you haven't spoken yet, one of the gaps that I think I could identify right here is how do you get the red bubble, I'm going to just say it, how do you get the red bubble to take as legitimate some of these solutions, like fact-checking? So do you have any ideas on that? How do you reach across?
I feel like I would have a lot more money in my bank account if I knew how to solve this problem. It is kind of one of the hard problems of our time and one of the things that I think we're wrestling with most. The solution that I would focus in on, and I think something that we have to get past, is the idea that we're going to have quick solutions that are effective at hitting the entire problem. This is a very long-term problem. I think Mr. Cerf got to it when he talked about education and about teaching people how to consume news and how to critically think again, and I think that's going to be a very long-term solution that is less satisfying. But it can't just be the people in this room. And the organizers of IGF USA have a Herculean task in front of them putting on this conference. And I think they did an amazing job, and I'm so excited to be here. And I love the gender diversity on this panel. As anybody who pays attention to me yelling about gender diversity will know. But I think we need more marginalized communities in the room. I think we need people from poor neighborhoods. I think we need more racial diversity. Because, as was mentioned this morning, people approach this problem in very different ways. And so you need to get the cultural representation to understand how the left and how the right are thinking and how they're coming to this and what they will respect. Because if you keep talking in the real world like we're talking on the internet world in these bubbles, it's very hard to get the inputs in that you need to get the output that's going to have the impact that we want. And so I would push for us to open up conversations a lot more, to get a lot more people involved in this problem, in solving this problem.
So maybe Breitbart should be a speaker next time?
Absolutely. And try to think where they're coming from. And I think you need to understand both sides of the problem. And I think most people have a very hard time breaking out of their own bubble and getting to the other side and where people are coming
I
from.
just wanted to ask you a follow-up because you haven't said that much yet, which is, when we were talking beforehand, you had concerns about regulation, government. So I guess I would ask, what shouldn't we do to try to bridge the gap or to fix what we are describing as a problem?
Sure. So I'm admittedly struggling a little bit up here because I was told we weren't allowed to have coffee in this room. Now, I can see you all. I know who's breaking the rules. I'm very jealous. But when you walked in, you're like, what's going to happen? What is the impact of breaking this rule? Probably not too much. I think that if you start looking at government regulation of fake news, first of all, you're only going to solve the problems on the margins. What is incredibly fake news and what is very factually sound. And the gray areas are much harder. And so what we're going to get to is more censorship, more taking away of some of that gray material that people should maybe have access to. But the people on the extreme ends who don't really get that the punishment is going to outweigh the benefits of them sharing the material are still going to put that out there. And so it will hurt the news that people maybe should have access to that is going to stretch their critical thinking abilities. It will not stop, I think, the rampant spread of fake news. And so those are the solutions I think we should veer away from, these ideas of taking material offline and censorship in favor of the critical thinking. I think actually Facebook has announced some really interesting approaches, again, dealing with the margins. I don't know if they've gotten into that gray area yet of what is maybe fake news and maybe not. The Onion story that got circulated a lot this weekend about Sean Spicer's heroics and how he's an American hero. Did everybody see that? That popped up in my feed a lot. People were sharing it. That is kind of where I think that we're going to have problems. It's not going to be the other story I saw a lot. There is a really tragic story. Chester Benningfield, who is one of the lead singers of Linkin Park, committed suicide over the weekend. And there was a story that it wasn't suicide, it was homicide. And he was conspiring with Chris Cornell to out child molesters in the entertainment business. And all of a sudden, there's this great conspiracy that has murdered these two very prominent entertainers. All fake. There's no truth to it at all. I think we can get at that story. I'm more worried about the Onion story, about these gray areas.
In Europe, where I took a trip to talk to people about how they're dealing with disinformation and Russian propaganda, one of the things they've done, for instance, in Germany, is they've gotten on Facebook and Twitter, they've threatened regulation that's made them both do things that they should have been doing already. But the other thing they did is politicians worried about bots in politics decided, I'm sure they were pressured by their supporters, to pledge not to use bots during the campaign. So there's ways to pressure government and government officials without actually regulating if the public joins in. So Craig, and Karen, do you have ideas about how to breach the ideological gap that we saw in the presentation? Or do you even think it's important to do that?
Well, the usual solution involves throwing out the term media literacy, somehow training people to be able to tell when they're seeing something which is crap, basically, or otherwise. And the people who are invested in media literacy say that there's progress coming. I don't know if it is. And so I'm, there's a lot to be said for professionalism in a field. and that includes fact-checking. And like I say, there are these networks of fact-checkers coming along. So that's the only hope I see.
Do you know if there's any evidence that the fact-checking sites are viewed on the more conservative media? Do they have fact-checking sites?
Right now, what I see from the kind of media you're talking about is that they'll see a fact check from PolitiFact or Snopes, and if they don't like it, they just try to undermine the fact checker. Mm-hmm. That's all that I see so far, but I fear that the lens through which I view this is a little too narrow. I'm trying to be optimistic, and all this, because the opposite of optimism is despair. And
You're trying to avoid that.
one could easily fall into that. So I do see the fact-checking networks beginning to get their act together collectively, and I see the platforms, in particular Facebook and Google, struggling to try to find ways to deal with all this. And I think that their struggle is in good faith. And I see them also getting a lot of criticism, unfair criticism, for not having a solution already for really difficult problems for which no one has a solution so far. You'll forgive me, it just seems, it kind of pisses me off some when I see people getting criticized for not having solutions which are active areas of research.
Well, that sort of gets us to the issue of transparency and disclosure. You know, one of the criticisms of of the two big social media companies is that they're not more transparent, not more willing to share what they're doing, but also what the problem is, and some of their metadata. Do you think that that is an issue, that there should be more transparency from those companies?
Well, we're talking about transparency of stuff like the algorithm Facebook uses to figure out what it should put in your feed, the algorithms used by Google News to rank news items, that kind of stuff. It also includes the algorithms used to try to figure out when a user profile is actually a troll, or for that matter, a bot in a botnet. And it's really tough because, speaking as a tech guy, on behalf of all tech people,
Thank you.
Emotionally, we're predisposed to telling people what's going on, to being very transparent. But if you tell people how you make those decisions, then immediately bad guys will figure out what you're doing, will figure out how to game it, and then and implement countermeasures. And so all the good work that you as a platform may have done is ruined. So far, the response, for the most part with platforms, is to not be transparent in any manner, because they figure no matter how transparent they are, they're in a lose-lose position. I'm talking with them internally about how people can be a little more transparent, because I've been through some of this firsthand in simpler cases. For example, when you're talking about spam and scams, let's say in a classified ad site, you want to tell people what you're doing about countermeasures. But as soon as you say anything substantive, then bad actors not only start figuring out countermeasures, but they actually talk about what you said and what could be countermeasures in black hat discussion boards. Something one of my own folks showed me about 10 years ago. I said a few things about security, and then they all showed up in a black hat discussion board. And that's why people don't talk about anything security related or against trolling, because if you go a little too far, you've told the bad guys what to do to get around your stuff.
So there's a lot of talk about transparency. I'm a big fan of transparency, particularly government transparency. With algorithms, I actually think one of the things we need to talk a lot more about is algorithmic accountability. And I love the term the ambassador used, algorithmic integrity. because one of the groups of people I'm very worried about are these non-technical users of the internet, which I would imagine is most of the people who are on the internet. They're not going to look at an algorithm if they can see it and know anything. It's going to be the people who can game it and who are looking to game it. So we need to be describing these things, not being transparent with what they are, but being transparent with what they do and what they're designed to do, so that a lay audience can understand and know what they might be subject to if they're posting. And I think the integrity, I had not heard that before, but I was a big fan of what you were describing there.
How would that work?
Oh, no. I like that. Like, don't criticize people for ongoing research. I like that idea. I don't know yet. I guess I feel like we're in this no man's land and we don't quite realize it yet. That there's been a tradition where there was a lot more disclosure of who was spending money, both from the spender and then from the broadcaster on both sides. And now we're in this post-Citizens United world where we have these C4 groups and this post-broadcast world where there's no obligation for the place where the ad is being bought to disclose. And we have to figure out a way around that. And I'm not quite sure what it is, but this idea of having trolls and bots and dark posts, that seems really troubling. When, as recently as 2002 or 3, I forget when McCain-Feingold was passed, we had a requirement enacted into law where you had to say, I'm Al Gore and I paid for this ad. So we have this, as I said, the Supreme Court has said transparency in political advertising is completely consistent with the First Amendment, but we're just in this sort of post-policy design world where the FEC is completely broken, and we have a new media, and we're not quite sure what to do. And I'm not suggesting that it has to be a government regulation. It may be something that the platforms come up with, but this situation seems dangerous.
Oxford University has the Computational Propaganda Project, and one of the complaints they have is that because social media companies restrict, some of them are better than others, restrict the kind of data they will give them confidentially just to produce their research, you can only do so much research. And the research that they have done has showed, like you said, this whole new, it's not even new. I mean, it happened. President Obama did this when he was a candidate. But the micro-targeting and marketing of issues, specific to certain locations, is sort of like the dark money. It's undisclosed. So, is just providing this information on a confidential basis, perhaps, to researchers who can look at the effect of bots and trolls, or is that maybe one of the solutions?
One other thing I just want to throw out there is, so a lot of what we hear happened is that not only were people micro-targeted, not only were they fed complete lies, but it was in some cases to dissuade them from voting. So
Yes.
like when you really think about the anti-democratic implications, that people in Little Haiti in Miami were told lies about, in order to get them disgusted and not turn out to vote. So I feel like we need to do a little, even more than just give the data to the researchers. But again, I'm not sure what exactly that is.
Data can often be extracted from databases, like you're thinking, and hopefully sanitized so that no one's privacy is being compromised. But that's a lot of work. And in our current cultural and legal environment, there's a high probability that someone will launch a lawsuit regarding privacy. And so the pragmatics of getting that stuff out, that's really, really tough to do. So the devil's in the details there. And it could be that in any big.com, the lawyers are just saying that no matter how well-intentioned they are and how good a job they do, it's going to be a lose-lose proposition. And that accounts for a fair amount of this behavior. Also, there's the war between the principles of transparency and yet do no harm. Sometimes you want to tell people everything, and yet if you do tell people everything, you're going to be doing harm in unanticipated ways. Tangentially, I just want to thank everyone who's been commenting on Twitter, providing some useful feedback. As you look at me, of course, you see a guy who's just built for speed. And of course, I have been checking that, and thanks, that will play into my future work there.
We're going to turn it over to the audience questions in a minute, including social media. So, of course, what would your question be, Dr. Sir?
How's that?
Join us
So
up here, too. You know.
this is a question for Craig. I have to get my glasses on to do this right. Quid custodiet ipsos custodes? Translation, if you really want, yes, okay. How would you like to respond to that question with regard to what's true and what isn't?
Can you translate that for everyone else?
Who watches the watchers?
Yes.
Depending on your favorite translation of that. And that's a big problem there. And in a way, from one perspective, unsolvable. What seems to be emerging, though, is that that's why I keep talking about networks of fact checkers. The deal is that, first, the International Fact Checking Network has a code of conduct, a code of ethics, which includes the requirement that the work being done in fact checking must be presented in a transparent manner, so that if a alleged fact checker, if they're doing a good job, you see that, and if they're faking it, you can see that also. You also have a lot of redundancy in numbers, because there's fact checkers fact checking each other, and so you can probably do the best that humans can do in watchdogs watching watchdogs, because it's a recursive problem, a computational term I use in honor event. That's hilarious if you're a computer sciences guy. But the deal is that if you have someone being a watchdog, let's say a cop, then you may have someone watching the watchdog, but who watches the watchdog that watches the watchdog, and that goes on indefinitely. So the solutions for that seem to be a combination of transparency and redundancy, which is about as good a solution as humans can ever do until we're ruled by our machine overlords. And I, for one, welcome our machine overlords.
We're working on that. Dana, would you permit me to ask 2 more questions?
Yes.
Since I have to leave at 10:30?
I will, yes.
Thank you very much for that.
And you can answer them, too.
So this is an observation for Amy. You asked for transparency, and Craig points out some of the side effects of trying to be transparent about algorithms. It occurs to me that we're reaching a point now with multi-level neural networks that we actually don't know exactly how they work. And so if you ask us to explain, the answer is, I don't know. So your point about trying to explain what you're intending to do as opposed to exactly how does it do it might turn out to cope with that problem, where we get to the point where some of these algorithms are not so easy to explain. They're just a consequence of a training database. I'm not sure that's a question for you as much as it's reinforcement for your idea. But you'll take it. Good for you. The last point I wanted to make, a question actually, if I can find it here. Okay, yes. So one of the things that it occurs to me frequently is that when you see things that you don't like, outcomes that you don't like, sometimes it's really important to understand the incentives that are driving those outcomes, because only until you understand that will you figure out whether you can change those incentives to drive different outcomes. So Amy's suggestion to have Breitbart show up, for example, which I, kind of frisson runs up and down my back when I think about that. But one might ask the question, what drives those kinds of behaviors, and is there anything to be done to change those incentives? So we have this general problem that we've all been talking about now, about disinformation, misunderstandings, polarization, bubble effects. What's driving that? And does anyone on the panel or anyone else in this room think that there are ways of changing the incentives that are producing these outcomes that we think are harmful?
Can I just respond to that too? Which is so much, one of the basic things in journalism, if you don't know what story to go after, is to follow the money. And usually half or more of the incentives of what we're talking about derive from following the money, derive from making money. And your great mini history of this whole problem really took off when the business model for journalism started failing. And journalists, mainstream journalism organizations, the Washington Post, the New York Times, I believe started down the road of fake news. That's a little harsh, but native advertising being one of them. Native advertising blurred the distinction between what's actually professionally reported and what's reported by advertisers. Or how about search engine optimization? And the whole, how do we get eyeballs here so that we can tell our advertisers so that we might get some money on the web through the advertisers? So, that economic crisis really drove in the mainstream a lot of the problems that we see today. Did you want to?
Yeah, I kind of want to tie it a little bit back into the first question, because it's not only, I think, incentives of the people creating the news, but also the people consuming it. And there's this awesome comic in the Oatmeal about George Washington and his teeth, and objective statements about George Washington's wooden teeth. And people tend to pretty passionately look at the citations for the one they don't agree with, because they want to prove it wrong. They want to consume news that kind of reinforces their worldview, and I think that's a theme that's been brought up here quite a bit today. And so trying to figure out the incentives of consumption and figure out how we can open up that consumption to get people to take in things that maybe they don't agree with as much, expand out a little bit. Instead, we've been, our social networking worlds have been continually closing in as the years go on. We've been reinforcing our bubbles, and it's very hard to break out of that. We don't even really want to break out of that. And we're reinforcing, the networks are reinforcing the things that we want. And I think we need to start figuring out where those incentives come in and trying to open our worlds up a little bit more.
And on that, I think I'll open the floor for questions. Yes, over here. Do we have microphones that are going to follow people?
Thank you very much. This was an outstanding panel. I've heard a couple of threads here that I think point to some of the problems. One is speed, because it's hard to have critical thinking quickly. And we are prompted to like something based on the clickbait headline alone and to click within a second or two. I think that some of the business models depend on speed. In television, to get an impression to justify the advertising rates, you probably have to watch a 30-second or a 60-second commercial. But if you're getting paid per click in an internet business model, then the faster the clicks, the better. And I think we get trained to click, 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 faster, faster, faster. And I think you made a great point about the native advertising as fake news. The blurring between news and entertainment is another aspect of it. So with these, I just wanted to highlight these because maybe they are analyzing these as the beginning of the solution, but where do we go when the fundamental incentive is for people to make more money by faster clicks?
Do you have a thought about the solution to the problem you've identified? Or does anyone else in the room?
Well, it would be
No, it's great.
manipulative, and I don't believe in manipulation, but it would be you can't click on something till 2 minutes after you've read it. But I've learned, this goes to the point that Mr. Cerf was making, I've discovered a new joy again of reading paper newspapers and reading a 16-paragraph article rather than reading 2 paragraphs and getting bored and moving on. It's important to train people. I agree with the premise that that education is required, but we have to offer persons an opportunity to get deeper when every incentive right now is to be shallower.
Thank you.
Add one tiny thing to that, which is that some of the research that I'm reading, as I alluded to, is suggesting that, that speaks to this lizard part of our brain, where you see shares, et cetera, and it tends to favor more sensationalist, extremist content. So it favors the fake news over the civically important news, which takes some getting your head around, but it kind of makes sense. The more, and the Bankler article goes through, again, this paranoid nature of this fake news. It's often conspiratorial and tells you what others, for you to want to share something, it should be something that would be new to your friends, so it's not widely available, so it fosters this the exact opposite of what we want.
It's veggies versus salt and sugar.
So can I add something real quick? Because I think that one of the things that I was trying to get at with diversity is, time is a privilege for a lot of people. I think we forget that the ability to consume 700-page novels is a privilege. And a lot of people who are in those marginalized communities I referenced don't have that privilege. And I think some of the speed and some of the fast consumption of news also comes back to the fact that people often don't have the time at certain ends of the spectrum to engage on the level that other people might have. And so having other voices in the conversation, I think, will help us think through some of the other aspects of the speed problem that the people in this room might not be able to get to.
Could speakers identify themselves before they ask a question? Yes.
Thank you. It's Steve Del Bianco with NetChoice. And I'd like all the panelists to respond in some way with the extent to which they want agency to improve their perception of algorithms. Because I think all of you would be very disappointed with transparency of algorithms, because Vint, maybe it is easy to explain, the views with the most clicks rise to the top of the feed with other parameters in there. So it's going to end up being a function of what users are choosing. Ambassador Kornblue said to us, let's counter the preference of users, which seems anti-democratic, seems anti-neutral. And frankly, the transparency problem would really surface when people want to know, how are you countering my preferences? So the question is, are the panelists advocating new mandates for what companies put in their algorithms, or are you just mandating that we educate people so that they make, in your opinion, better choices?
You want to start here?
Yeah, so thanks, Steve. I definitely did not mean what you're suggesting the implication was. Thank you for bringing that up. I would not in any way want an algorithm that purported to give people what they wanted and gave them something else. But I do think we have to think about, the instant news feed that allows anyone to post something that's considered news. Let me take a step back. Obviously, something being news or journalism has some import as a validation, right? Otherwise, everyone would just be posting as themselves. Why would they be posting as Breitbart, InfoWars, or any of these others? Why would they be purporting to be news? So there's some validation function that happens there. But what does it mean right now? We're not sure what it means. And the algorithm does put its finger on the scale, as we see in some of the research, on this sensationalist extremist. So I'm urging that we think about what universe we're in, where people think they're getting validation, but instead they're getting another share of something that's clickable. Really what it means is it's clickable, it's shareable, it's scalable. There's a as our new communications director, Scaramucci, says, there's an arbitrage gap there. I think we have to think about.
Anyone else?
And this is that tough balance between transparency and do no harm. Though I think consumers would like to see watchdogs regarding the algorithms, and that could be governmental or it could be private self-regulatory agencies. I tend to favor the private self-regulatory agencies, and that would have to be a big trusted relationship that when a company discloses sensitive proprietary information, they have to have guarantees that it won't be leaked to bad actors. So I guess my own personal bias is towards, my bias would be towards industry self-regulation without that kind of leakage. And I also think it's the most probable given the current political environment. I could also see it as a public-private partnership. The idea is to do the best you can with regards to that balance and just make sure that the information isn't passed to bad guys.
Yeah, so my focus was mostly on accountability, which I think goes to the education piece. And I have a non-technical example that might be particularly appropriate given the topic of this conversation, which was a Breitbart story, I think it was published in late January, on the fact that Trump won the majority of the votes in America's heartland. It was getting to this question of if Trump won the majority or not. And the Washington Post did a great review of that story and said, well, yes, if you define the heartland as this part of the country and this part of the country and this part of the country, they're absolutely right. And I think that you need that second piece to understand the first story. I think also it provides an interesting definitional question of if that first story is fake or not, considering the creative defining of geography that Breitbart was using. But the reader, I think, deserves to know the information that goes into what they're reading.
Thank you. Another question here?
Andrew Mack, AM Global. Great, interesting conversation. I agree with Steve. I'm not sure that this is something that is ripe for legislation in some way to bound, but I'd like to suggest that this may be a classic prisoner's dilemma, in the sense that the good of the many is not necessarily being captured, and the good of the individual in the moment, in this particular instance, is all that we're seeing. And so what I wonder is whether, outside of trying to manipulate the system, whether we can try to look at the algorithms to give some sort of weight to what is good for community as well as what is good in the moment for the atomized individual. It seems to me that the individual has a short-term and a long-term, and the algorithm that doesn't capture both the value of the short-term and the value of the long-term is missing value for the company, for the service, as well as for the individual and for the community. We're in this weird world where we talk a lot about social media, but really a lot of the problems are antisocial behavior. And so maybe that's the part that we should be looking at trying to fix. Thank you.
Comments?
That was really well said.
I think Mr. Surf started with this, I wrote it down, referred to our bubbles as isolation from the facts. And I thought that was a really interesting way to put it, because I tend to think of bubbles as like your community, and like the antithesis of isolation is you are putting yourself into a community. And so I think both thinking of a bubble as a community as well as isolation from other communities, I think, is a really interesting way to start thinking about long-term how to open up in getting information into those bubbles.
Other questions over here?
Yes, and then can we come over here?
Okay, go ahead.
Several people waiting.
Thank you. My name is Jennifer Fiore. I started in print journalism, moved to AOL in the mid-90s, and then ended up in political communications. So as you might understand, this is one of the more pressing issues in my mind for our democracy. I speak to a lot of people who are not in this room, people who use social media in particular to get information about babies and pets and all kinds of great videos. They're concerned, and they're not using social media so much anymore, primarily because it is an argumentative space. It's a space with a great deal of fake news. They don't know what to trust. And I think that what I'm hearing is a retreat from social media and then a retreat from news in general. And I'm curious when the business models, in particular for Facebook, Twitter, and Google, will catch up to the point of making a response that is a business-centered response to a human-centered problem, pressured by not just their customers, but in fact also their shareholders, to address this issue. And then separately, Ambassador Kornblue, is there a moment where we think about, as maybe that moment's already here, those companies as companies in the public interest in the way that we have in broadcasting? Thank you.
Can you be more explicit about what you mean by the social media companies taking their responsibility?
Sure. There was a great article in the New York Times Magazine a month or two ago about Facebook in particular. And it looked at how Facebook has the capacity to make a lot of changes around suppressing fake news, what it understands as fake news, but that in fact it's responding to what it believes users prefer. Users say they want trustworthy journalism. Users click on fake news because it's fun and entertainment. So the question is, at what point does the public interest of Facebook collide, collude is a really great word right now, but collide in this case with the business interests?
Who would like to take that on?
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but I think I'd like any platform I'm using to give me some kind of guide based on working with a lot of other people if the news item that I'm about to look at or possibly share is from a reliable source or otherwise. I'd also like it to be labeled in terms of, I'd like it to be told, hey, is this intended to be satire or something else? So like if it's coming from The Onion, I want to be able to see it's that. If it's an opinion piece, I'd like to know that it's an opinion piece. And if it's from a source which is not reliable, I'd like some help there. I think that's the direction that they're moving in, but those are hard problems.
I mean, this again gets to this gray area of what is fake news or not, and what people define as fake news, and it's hard. And I actually really appreciate the position that Facebook and other social media are in. It's saying what is definitively fake and should be not shared, and what is in these like Breitbart-y gray areas. And I don't know if anybody has solved that problem. We should be spending more time. I think it gets back again. I'm going to keep harping on this because it's something I like to harp on, of representative conversations that are actually talking to people outside of the sphere and what people think of as fake or not fake, and trying to make sure we're respecting that point of view.
I guess what I would add is, the broadcast framework is interesting just in that it was purposeful, but we can't use the same framework. I mean, there's a whole school of First Amendment law that grew up around broadcasting because of the scarcity, and because so broadcasters were given, there was a debate about whether there should be common carriage or whether the broadcaster should be getting full editorial control, and the compromise was you're going to be given this spectrum, it's not common carriage, but you will act as the fiduciary for the public. That's really unique. We're not going to tell Facebook, in the same way that that's what they are. And we have this important Section 230. We don't want to turn we don't want to turn ISPs or intermediaries into censors. We have the First Amendment that we have to be really careful about. But I think what we're all exploring is, okay, but that doesn't mean that truth and journalism and civic debate don't matter. So, how do we come up with a construct in this new world? Transparency's obviously got to be front and center. That shouldn't be controversial. But how do we get there? And again, we're in this broader environment of dark money, but also social media allows even less transparency. I mean, not only does Facebook not need to say who bought an ad the way a broadcaster, a cable company, or a satellite does, but you can run an ad that nobody else sees on Facebook, which is harder to do on NBC, So if you run a really negative ad against your opponent, not only do you have to say, I sponsored this ad, but everybody else will see it. Mm-hmm. And so perhaps you'll get some blowback. We've seen that. You can run a dark post ad that nobody else sees and nobody knows who pays for it. So I'm in this weird situation that I think a bunch of us in the room are in, where we're grappling for some solutions in a totally new environment, but we don't want to take cookie cutter solutions. We can't legally, constitutionally.
Over here?
Hi, I'm David with the Technology Safety Council, and I just have a not so crazy idea I'd like to throw out for your consideration as to how to educate people, educate especially young people, to be good, sustainable, safe, sustainable users of media, consumers of media. So we're working on a different project, a certificate for new users to be safe and sustainable users of technology, looking at the risks of melatonin depletion, macular degeneration, and dopamine habituation associated with overuse of smartphones and that sort of thing. How hard would it be to also include a curriculum component about being a consumer, a safe consumer of media, giving kids over the age of 13, getting their first device, for instance, you know, some tips, some instruction on how to consume media. And if that were a component of this training certificate that's going out in so many different languages in the fall, how would you boil that down? If you have just one slide to talk to your teen about preparing them to consume media in the future, what would those, you know, top 4 or 5 points be that would point them in the right direction?
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Due to personal circumstances, I've spent a lot of time in Florida and in Ohio this year, which are very, very different from DC. And I think my top recommendation would be not to have one slide, because I think you would use 4 or 5 different points to speak to those 2 very different audiences, not to mention when you get into global and different languages. So it would be to respect the communities and the different ways that people learn and will learn things. I also got to spend a really wonderful week with my 13-year-old niece. And I have to say, I was blown away at her sophistication with knowing how to consume media. And I think it surpassed anything I would have expected in adults that I speak to, because she has grown up with this. And this idea of digital natives, I think, is very distinct from what a lot of people in this room are used to. And it needs to also not only respect the different communities, but respect the idea that they've been around these devices now since birth, and they come at it in very different ways.
Yeah, the Dana Boyd, who's probably as knowledgeable as anyone in this kind of area, just talks about their studies, some of which is articulated in her book, It's Complicated, saying that well-meaning attempts to help people be safe are more likely to do damage than to help them out. Again, right now, for the most part, kids in particular are better at figuring that out with each other than adults can be. Adults can only lead them towards, by pointing out what's problematic, may in fact only make it tempting. I mean, there's always well-behaved, nerdy kids like me who would work on, but I'm probably the exception, and not in a good way.
So as neither a techie nor a wonk in this area, I'll take the opposite view, and I would say if I had a slide that had 4 points on it, the top one would be who wrote the story. And then you would be able to click on the person's name, and some kind of thing would come up that would give you a little mini bio of the journalist. And you know, you're talking about fact checking, right? So let's not have it so complicated that you have to figure out whether Breitbart's real or not, or the Washington Post is real or not. Let's just look at the journalist who wrote it. And I did this recently when I was on a radio talk show, and I looked at one of our reporters, and then I just randomly chose one of the Breitbart reporters. And the experience level was so different that you might say, that matters. So maybe we need a big database of the people who write. Anyone else? Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Working? Thank you. Hi, Miriam Sapiro from Finsbury. That was a terrific kickoff presentation by Dr. Cerf, and it's been really a fantastic discussion. I wanted to take us back for a moment to the nationalism part of the challenge this morning and Vince's suggestion that we think more concretely about what the U.S. can contribute to the IGF. I think there's some really important questions which we've touched a little bit on here and there regarding the role of government or governments in trying to solve these problems. So theoretically, can they be conducive to finding some solutions, or should they get out of the way? If there's some vision that they might be helpful, how do we ensure that more authoritative perspectives don't end up addressing some of the concerns that we've identified in a most unhelpful way?
Mm-hmm.
If we do think there's a role for government, from the U.S. perspective, is the U.S. government currently one that would have credibility on this issue? And if so, or even if not, how can we as the multi-stakeholder environment try to grapple with that question? And as Karen said, much of this is regulated in different media environments. Those solutions probably don't work here. But again, government played a role there. So I really think it's something that we need to think through a bit more concretely between now and the next IGF and see whether there's a constructive way forward. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say, Miriam, that's really helpful. I don't think we have a choice. I mean, the U.S. has played an indispensable role, I think, in helping to ensure that the internet is open and free and a place for civic discourse and expression and innovation. And so I think we have to figure out what our role is, whether we would be, immediately credible or not. I think that's part of our leadership job, and so I think your charge is a great one.
Well, if I could add, one of the items that is being contemplated right now in the government is whether they should have a bigger role in counter-propaganda. And in history shows us, and I actually am having these conversations with information operations people from the Defense Department and others, that they would like to do that. They would like to turn Radio Free Liberty and Voice of America into, they would not want to call it propaganda, but into outlets that more offensively, not, try to counter Russian propaganda with something that is mandated and thought up by the U.S. government. So that is going to be out there as a debate as soon as we know more about it. Anyone else have the?
I mean, just one person's, unacceptable content is another person's censorship, and I think the U.S. needs to lead in saying that you can't get rid of certain viewpoints, and when you start taking down bad content in one area, it's going to look very different in other areas. And we wrote a frequently asked questions about fake news, where we, I think, specifically identified you need to stay away from the content takedowns, from anything mandating what is good content to disseminate and what is bad content, because other governments are going to follow that lead in ways that are very repressive.
Craig, would you like to be our closer for the panel?
All these issues, some of them are just really tough and may not be solvable in some cases. I just like everyone to assume good faith on the part of people, including the big platforms and so on, to give them a break. And separately, I do want the people who do have clout in newspaper and related organizations to start protecting their people, because right now it's bad everywhere in the world in terms of the dangers that reporters face. It's only going to get worse. So please start working together to protect your people and to protect other people in the same business.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to the panelists.
I want to thank the panelists. Amy, I want you to know that you have been heard.